The gate hung open that August morning, and 41 people stood in the dust of the ridge road with their hats in their hands, because the woman they had spent a year and a half calling a fool now held the only Sweetwater within 9 miles. You could hear the pump jacks of the drought all through the county that summer, meaning you could hear nothing at all. The creeks gone to cracked clay. The county-line stock ponds shrunk to green scum rings, and every cistern in the settlement of Marrow Fork drawn down to mud and rust. They had come to her because there was nowhere else to come. They had come to Della Pruett, 34 years old, who had bought 38 acres of honeysuckle-choked hardpan for the back taxes owed on it, $140 and change, and who had stood in the courthouse hall a year and a half before while these same neighbors laughed into their sleeves. She stood now at the well. She had never dug. The well no living person had known was there, and she said nothing while they waited. The verdict they wanted from her that day was not really hers to give. It had been rendered long before, quietly, by the land itself and by a herd of animals nobody in Marrow Fork thought worth feeding. But to understand why the whole county went still when Della Pruett folded her arms across her chest, you have to go back to the spring she arrived, back before anyone knew her name, back when they only knew there was a woman alone come to farm the worst piece of ground in the district. She had come up from the flat country in a borrowed wagon with everything she owned lashed under a tarp. And the first thing the men on the courthouse steps noticed was that there was no husband walking beside her, and no husband coming behind. That was the thing they fixed on and could not let go. A woman alone, they said to one another, as if the words were a diagnosis, as if they explained in 2 syllables everything foolish that was about to follow. The property she had bid on was 38 acres on the north slope of Hardscrabble Knob, land that had passed through 3 owners in a decade and beaten all 3, land so overrun with bush honeysuckle that from the road it looked like a single green tumor swelling up the hillside. Honeysuckle is a thief. It leaps out before anything native wakes. It steals the light. It poisons the soil against the seedlings of oak and hickory. And it grows in a thicket so dense a grown man cannot walk through it without a blade. The last owner had let it take the whole north slope and half the pasture, and then he had stopped paying his taxes and left the county owing more than the dirt was worth. When the parcel came up at the delinquent tax sale, only one bid was entered. Twa. Bah. It came from a quiet woman in a man's work coat, and it was for $141.18, which was the exact figure of the arrears, and which was 90% of the money Della Pruett had left in the world. The auctioneer read her name off the form twice because he thought he had misheard it, and when the crowd understood that the honeysuckle slope had actually sold to her on purpose, a low laugh went around the courthouse like water finding its level. A rancher named Coy Tolliver, who ran 400 acres of improved pasture on the far side of the knob and thought of himself as the natural conscience of the district, said out loud that he would give her $100 flat to take the eyesore off her hands before she ruined herself. Said it kindly. Said it the way you would offer $1 to a child who had traded her boots for a handful of buttons. Della looked at him and said, "No, thank you, I mean to farm it." That was all she said, and it was the first sentence most of them ever heard her speak. And Coy Tolliver laughed, hardest of all, because he could not conceive of a thing on that slope worth farming, unless she meant to farm the laughter of her neighbors, of which she would have a bumper crop for years. Here is the arithmetic she carried out of that courthouse, and it is worth setting down plain, because it is the ledger her whole life balanced on that spring. She had $19 left after the taxes. She had a wagon he had to give back. She had a spavined mule she had bought for $8, bringing her down to 11. And she had penned in a rented lot behind the feed store, 40 head of goats that the same feed store had been trying to unload for a month because their previous owner had died and left no one who wanted them. Goats in Marrow Fork in that era were vermin with an appetite. A man kept a goat or two to clear a fence line, and was faintly embarrassed about it. Nobody ran goats as a herd. Cattle were dignity, hogs were money, goats were what a poor widow kept when she could not afford a proper animal, and a herd of 40 of them following a woman alone up onto a honeysuckle slope was, to the settled opinion of the county, the single most ridiculous procession anyone had witnessed in a generation. They named the sight before they knew the woman, the goat woman of Hardscrabble Knob. She heard it and did not flinch, and she paid the last $10 for a month's rent on the lot, down to her final dollar, and walked her 40 goats up the ridge road behind her $8 mule, and the thicket closed over the top of the slope like a green wave, and she went into it and was not seen down in the settlement for 11 days. What she did in those 11 days was fail, and nearly quit, and then not quit, and the not quitting is the whole of the story. She had a notion when she bought the place, a notion she had gotten from a single paragraph in a farming almanac read by lamplight in the flat country, that goats would eat honeysuckle. This is true. It is the truest thing in the almanac. A goat is not a cow. A cow wants grass and sulks at a bush. A goat is a browser, built nose to tail to strip a woody thicket, and honeysuckle to a goat is candy, the sweet green candy that gives the plant its name. But a notion in an almanac and 40 animals, loose on 38 acres, are two different countries, and the distance between them is measured in blistered hands and sleepless nights. The goats scattered. Half of them climbed the thicket rather than eating it, and got tangled and had to be cut free. 2 went lame in the rocks. 1 old doe simply lay down in the shade of the biggest honeysuckle and refused the world. Della had no fence worth the name, so she herded them by hand from dawn to dark, moving them a little at a time across the slope, and at night she penned them behind a hasty barrier of brush and rope, and slept sitting up against the mule with a stick in her hand, listening for coyotes. She ate cornmeal and creek water. She did her arithmetic every night. $10 gone to rent. No dollars coming in. 40 goats to feed? Except the goats were feeding themselves. That was the one line in the ledger that ran the right direction, and it was so thin a comfort against the rest that on the 9th night she sat with her face in her raw hands and did the arithmetic that says a person is beaten. Then one of the young does, a spotted thing she had not named, walked up in the dark and lipped at her sleeve, patient and warm and smelling of crushed honeysuckle leaf, and Della understood without words that the animal was not afraid and did not think the situation hopeless, and something in her decided to borrow that opinion until she could grow her own. In the morning she got up and went back into the thicket. On the 12th day, the old woman came. She lived on the adjoining 40, a widow named Ilsebe van der Molen, who had come from the Low Countries across the sea as a girl, and who spoke a soft, careful English, with the vowels rounded like river stones, and who was regarded in Marrow Fork with a respect that had a thin edge of fear on it. The way people respect a woman who has buried a husband and 2 grown sons and still tends her own bees. She did not come laughing. She came up the fence line with a jar of something in her hands, and she stood at the ruined corner where Della's brush pen leaned, and she watched the goats work the thicket for a long while before she spoke. Then she said in her careful way, "You are letting them eat the wrong way round." Della, exhausted past pride, asked her what she meant. The old woman set down her jar. "You chase them across the whole of it," she said. "So they take 1 bite of every bush, and no bush is finished. And the honeysuckle laughs at you, because a plant does not die from 1 bite. It dies from the same bite taken again and again in the same place, until the root gives up its hope. You must make them stay. You must make them eat 1 small piece down to the wood, and then move the fence. Not the goats." She tapped the leaning brush. "Not this. This they walk through in their sleep. You want a fence they respect. Small, and you move it every day, and behind it the ground is finished, and ahead of it the ground is full, and the goats will do in 1 season what 100 men with axes cannot do in 3. And then she said the thing that Della carried the rest of her life, the thing she would say back to the whole county on the day of the reckoning. The old woman looked at the green tumor of the slope, and she said, "The land keeps an honest ledger, child, but it writes very small, and it will not read the entry aloud to you. You must put your face down close and learn its hand." Then she picked up her jar, which was honey, and set it on the fence post as a gift and went home. That was the reframing that turned the whole thing over. Della had been thinking of the goats as 40 mouths she had to steer. Isabet had shown her they were a tool with an edge, and that all her steering was the problem. That what she needed was not a herder's stick, but a fence she could pick up and carry. She had $1, which was to say she had nothing, so she made the fence out of what the slope gave her. The culled honeysuckle stems themselves, and then when she found it, a great coil of woven wire fencing left rusting in the collapsed shed of the previous owner. 40 rods of it, enough if she moved it patiently to pen a quarter-acre at a time. She built a paddock the size of a garden and put the 40 goats in it and shut them up with the honeysuckle. And for the first 2 days they complained, and on the third day the quarter-acre was a ruin of stripped stems chewed to the bark, the sweet leaf gone, the bushes girdled and dying, the light suddenly falling all the way to a ground that had not seen the sun in a decade. Then she moved the wire one paddock over and did it again. Move the fence, not the goats. That became the rhythm of her days and the second line of her ledger, and it was the only line that ever ran in her favor. But it ran and did not stop. The boy came at the end of that first month. He belonged to the Hessam family down in the creek bottom, the poorest people in a poor settlement, and he was about 10 years old, all elbows and silence. And he took to climbing the ridge and sitting on the top rail of whatever paddock Della had built that day, watching the goats work with an attention no adult in the county would spend on them. His name was Tovi, and he did not talk for the first week. He only watched, and then, one afternoon, he pointed at the big buck, the patriarch of the herd, a heavy gray animal with a beard like a preacher and a way of standing perfectly still in the center of the churning herd as if he were the peg the whole world turned on, and Toby said, "That one's the boss, and he ought to have a name, and I think his name is Deacon." And so the buck was Deacon after that, and the spotted doe that had nosed Della awake from her despair became Patience, and inside 2 weeks the boy had named all 40, and Della found that she had, without deciding to, acquired a partner and a witness. Someone who saw sense in the method when the whole county below them saw only a woman alone chasing vermin uphill. The boy asked for nothing. She fed him at noon because he was thin, and he carried water and helped shift the wire, and his blunt, small observations turned out to be worth more than most of the counsel she could have bought. "Deacon won't cross where the ground's still white," he said one day, meaning the goats would not step onto a paddock they had already stripped bare. And Della watched and saw he was right, and it saved her an hour a day of steering thereafter. Down in the settlement, the story hardened into a joke that people told strangers as local color. "Have you seen the goat woman?" they would say. "Bought the honeysuckle patch for the taxes. She's up there teaching goats to eat a mountain." And they would laugh, and Coy Tolliver, who repeated the offer twice more that summer, first at $110 and then, magnanimously, at $125, told anyone who would listen that he was only trying to save the poor creature from herself, and that the day would come when she would walk down that hill with her tail between her legs and beg him to take it. He wanted the land, though he never said the true reason plainly, and perhaps did not yet know it himself. Hardscrabble Knob sat at the head of the little watershed that fed the whole east side of Marrow Fork, and a man who controlled the top of a watershed controlled a great deal in a country where water was the difference between a herd and a hide. Coy owned 400 acres of improved pasture and 11 miles of pipe and 3 stock ponds, and he ran his cattle the way the county respected, fat animals on green grass, and he could not abide the sight of that honeysuckle slope in the corner of his kingdom, worked by an animal he despised, owned by a woman he could not buy. It offended his arithmetic. That is the fairest thing that can be said of Coy Tolliver, that at the start he was not wicked, only a man whose sums did not have a column for a thing he did not understand, and who assumed that anything outside his ledger must be worthless. The seasons turned and the slope changed, though only Della and the boy and the old woman could read the change. Where the goats had passed and the wire had moved on, the honeysuckle did not come back. The girdled bushes died standing and then fell, and the sun reached the ground. And the ground, freed after 10 years of shade and theft, remembered what it was. Native grasses that had waited as seed in the soil came up in the stripped paddocks, and the goats' hooves worked the fallen leaves and their droppings into the hard pan, and where there had been a green tumor, there began to be, in patches and then in acres, open savanna, oak seedlings standing free, blue-stem grass shoulder-high by the second summer. A slope healing from the top down under the working of 40 despised animals, and a woman who had learned to move a fence and hold her tongue. She sold the first goats that fall. Kids grown out on the sweet honeysuckle browse, and a drover passing through to the railhead looked them over in the pen behind the feed store and said he had not seen animals in that condition all the way up the valley, and paid her a price per head that made the feed store man's eyebrows climb, and paid it in silver. And that silver was the first line of income in Della Pruitt's ledger, and she banked it and said nothing. She had learned already the thing Ilsabe had not needed to teach her, which she thought of as banking a coal. You keep the fire low under the ash. You do not show the neighbors your warmth. You let them go on believing you are cold. And the coal keeps and grows against the winter you know is coming, even if you cannot yet name its shape. The winter she could not name arrived in the 3rd year, in the form of no rain at all. It came on the way such things come, a dry March that everyone excused, a April with one thin shower, a May the color of a bone. By June the drought had settled over the county like the open door of a furnace left standing wide, and everything that could be seen was the wrong color, the pastures going from green to tan to gray, the corn curling into itself, the great oaks along the creek dropping leaves in July as if it were October. Coy Tolliver's improved pasture, 400 acres of the county's pride, browned off entirely by the middle of July, because improved pasture is grass, and grass is the first thing a drought kills, and his cattle, which were bred to be fat on green, and knew no other way to live, began to walk his fences bawling. His 3 stock ponds went first to mud, and then to a cracked memory of ponds. He hauled water in barrels from the settlement cistern, until the settlement cistern showed its rusted bottom, and the whole east side of Marrow Fork stood at the lip of ruin, because in a drought, the arithmetic of a cattle country is brutally simple. No water means no herd, and no herd means no year, and no year, for many families, means no farm. But the goat woman's slope did not brown off the way the rest did. This was the thing the settlement could not fail to notice even from the road. And it was the thing that turned Coy Tolliver's contempt, which had been almost lazy, into something with teeth. Her paddock stayed a stubborn dull green longer than any pasture in the district, because native prairie grass sends its roots down 8 and 10 feet into the ground, and reaches water a lawn of improved fescue never dreams of. And because the goats, being browsers, ate the deep-rooted forbs and the drought-hardy brush that a cow will starve beside. Her animals were not fat, but they were sound, and they walked her healing slope and found enough, while all around them the cattle country died on its feet. And it was in that furnace summer, moving her wire across a paddock she had never worked before, on the steepest, lowest corner of the 38 acres, that Della Pruitt found the thing that turned the whole story over a second time. The goats had cleared. That week, a dense island of honeysuckle at the bottom of the slope that she had saved for last, because it grew so thick around a jumble of old stone that she had assumed the stone was only stone, a cairn some forgotten owner had raised out of the field. But when the goats ate it down to the wood, and the leaf fell away and the light came in, the stone showed itself to be laid stone. Courses of it, a round mouth of dry-laid rock sunk into the hillside and long since roofed over by the thief honeysuckle. It was a hand-dug well older than the settlement's memory, dug by whoever had first tried to hold that slope generations before the honeysuckle ever came, and abandoned and hidden and forgotten under 10 years of green theft on top of 40 years of neglect. Della cleared the mouth of it with her hands and the boy's help, and they lowered a stone on a string and heard, far down in the cool dark, the small, clean sound that in that summer was the most valuable sound in the county. A plunk, and then the ring of ripples against stone. Water, sweet water, deep and cold and steady, in a well that had gone on quietly filling itself from the healed watershed. All through the years everyone had called her a fool, in a summer when every other water in 9 miles had turned to mud or memory. She did the arithmetic that night, sitting on the well cap in the dark, with the boy asleep against the mule. And it was a different arithmetic than she had ever done before, because for the first time the numbers ran so far in her favor that they frightened her. She had, at the head of a dying watershed, in the worst drought the county had seen in 40 years, the only reliable sweet water for miles. And she had it because she had spent 3 years letting despised animals heal a slope that everyone said was worthless, which had let the ground remember its springs. She could have named any price. There were men in Marrow Fork who would have signed over a quarter of their land for a guaranteed barrel a day that August. And she sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a live coal in your bare hand, and she did not sleep, and in the morning she did what she had learned to do with every good thing that had come to her. She banked it. She covered the well with planks and brush against the sun, and against curious eyes, and she went on watering her own herd from it quietly. And she said nothing to anyone, because she had learned in 3 years exactly how the settlement rewarded a woman alone who showed her warmth too soon. She could not keep it forever. Of course, a secret, that valuable in a county, that thirsty grows legs. The way it got out was the boy Toby, who could not help telling his mother, who could not help telling her sister at the store. And within a week, the word had run the length of Merrill Fork that the goat woman had struck water up on Hartscrabble Knob. And within another week, Kai Tolliver had come up the ridge road in a clean shirt with a folded paper in his pocket, and the false warmth on his face that Della had learned to read like weather. He admired the healed slope out loud, as if he had always admired it. He admired the goats, as if he had never called them vermin. And then he laid out his proposition in the reasonable, kindly voice of a man doing a woman alone a great favor. He would buy the whole parcel, he said, well and all, at a price that was, he wanted her to understand, far more than the dirt had ever been worth, more than triple what she had paid. And he named a figure, and let it hang there in the heat. And it was a great deal of money to a woman who had once been down to $11. He would run a pipe, he explained, down to the settlement, and he would sell the water to the neighbors at a fair rate, and everyone would be saved, and she would be rich, and she could go back to the flat country and never chase a goat again. He said it all as though he were the answer to a prayer. Della let him finish. Then she asked him one question, in her quiet way, the way she had said no thank you, on the courthouse steps 3 years before. She asked him how he had known the well ran 12 feet deep to the water, since she had told no one that figure, since she had measured it herself in the dark and written it in no book. And Coy Tolliver, who was a proud man and not a careful liar, made the small slip that proud men make, and said that his hand had been up looking the ground over, meaning that he had sent someone onto her land to sound her well while she slept, and the instant the words were out he knew them for a confession. Della looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The well is not for sale, and neither is the water, and you can take your hand off my land the way you sent him onto it, at night, and never come back in daylight either." And Kai Tolliver's warmth fell off his face like a mask off a hook, and the true face under it was the face of a man who had never in his life been told no by a woman alone and did not have any arithmetic for it. And he folded his paper and rode down the ridge, and the war, which had been a joke, became a war. It got ugly the way such things get ugly. In a small place in a dry year, Coy Tolliver could not buy the water, so he set out to make it worthless to her by making the county afraid of it. He put it about that the well was old and foul, that the goat woman's animals had fouled it, that anyone who drank from Hartscrabble Knob would take the flux, and in a frightened settlement, a rumor about water travels like fire through cured grass. He went to the county board on which he sat and proposed an emergency measure to condemn the well as a public health hazard and place it under the board's control for the duration of the drought, which is to say under his control, framed as public safety. Framed as saving the settlement from the reckless woman who was hoarding water while children went thirsty. It very nearly worked because fear will believe anything that lets it act, and a hearing was called at the settlement meeting house on a Saturday in the killing heart of August, and the whole east side of the county came, and Coy Tolliver had his condemnation paper drawn and ready, and Della Pruitt was called to answer for the crime of owning a well he could not take before the meeting. Though came the thing that decided everything, and it came to her gate the evening before. Coy Tolliver himself did not come. The one who came was a man named Argyle Sims, who ran 160 acres down the creek, and who had been, 3 years before, the second loudest laugher in the courthouse after Coy himself, a prosperous, boastful man who had called her a fool to her face on the Ridge Road more than once. The drought had ruined him worst of all, because he had leveraged his good years into more cattle than his land could carry in a bad one, and he came up the Ridge Road on foot in the dust with his hat already in his hands, and he could not meet her eyes, and he said that his stock had not drunk clean water in 4 days, and that 2 of his calves were down, and that he had no money to offer her, that was worth anything and no right to ask, but that he was asking, and that he was sorry, and that he had been a fool, and she had not, and would she, for the love of God, let him fill a barrel. And Della Pruitt, who had every reason in the world to name a ruinous price to the man who had led the laughter at her, looked at Argyle Sims standing broken in her gate, and she said, "Take what your animals need. There is no charge for water, and come back tomorrow at the meeting and tell them what you told me." That was the moral choice, though nobody watching would have known a choice was being made. And it was made a full day before the reckoning, quietly in the dust, the way the land had told her all its important things. So they came to the meeting house on the Saturday, 41 souls in the furnace heat, and Coy Tolliver stood up first with his paper and made his case, that the well must be condemned for the safety of all and placed under the board, that the woman alone up on the knob could not be trusted to steward the county's only water in a crisis, and that he, out of pure public spirit, would undertake to distribute it fairly. He was good. He had always been good at the reasonable voice, and you could feel the frightened room begin to lean his way, because he offered them a thing that fear always wants, which is someone respectable to hand the problem to. And then Della Pruitt stood up, calloused hands folded, and did not raise her voice. She said she would answer the charge that her water was foul with one fact, which was that she and the boy and the mule had drunk from it every day for a month, and were standing there sound, and that any man who wished could drink a dipper of it right now. And she set a bucket of it, cold and clear, on the table at the front of the room. Then she turned to Coy Tolliver, and she said plainly that she found it curious the well should be foul in his telling and worth a fortune in his offer, both in the same month. And she reminded the room, in his own words, that his hand had been up on her land in the dark sounding a well he now called poison. And she watched the reasonable voice desert him a second time in front of 41 witnesses, and then she said the thing that turned the tide, the thing she had decided upon the evening before. She said the water was not for sale and never had been, not to him and not to the board, but that it was also not hers to hoard, because the land keeps an honest ledger, and she meant to balance hers. Any family in Marrow Fork that needed water could come and take it, and there would be no charge for the water, not 1 cent, because water was not a thing a person made and had no right to sell. What she would ask, she said, was that they help her keep the well and the pump and the troughs in repair, that they send a hand a day to work the line, and that they pay her only for the labor of keeping it running, which was fair because labor is a thing a person does make. She would not sell the gift. She would only ask to be paid for the work. Then Argyle Sims stood up in his ruined dignity and told the room what she had done for him at her gate the evening before, that she had filled his barrels and saved his calves and taken not a cent, and asked only that he come and tell the truth, and he told it, and when he sat down there was the silence in that hot room that was worth more than any silver. And the tide turned in an instant, the way it does after long restraint. And one by one the men who had laughed on the courthouse steps 3 years before took off their hats in the meeting house. And someone said, "Put away that paper, Koya," and someone else said it louder. And the condemnation died there, on the table, beside the bucket of clear, cold water that Kai Tolliver had called poison, and that no one, in the end, was afraid to drink. Coy Tolliver stood a moment with his useless paper in his hand, and his mask gone for good. And then he walked out of the meeting house into the furnace afternoon, defeated not by a lawyer or a gun or a richer man, but by simple decency practiced in front of witnesses. And his power over the east side of Marrow Fork went out of him as he went through the door. And he left the county before the next spring, and it is not recorded that anyone missed him. The rains came at the end of September, as rains finally do, breaking over Hardscrabble Knob, in a gray sweet curtain that the whole settlement stood out in with their faces turned up. But the well had carried them to the rain, and everyone knew it, and everyone knew who had carried the well. That fall a line of men came up the ridge with pipe and picks, sent a hand a day as she had asked, and they ran the water down to the settlement troughs, and the herds that were left drank clean, and the county paid Della Pruitt a fair wage for keeping the works, and she banked that too, low under the ash, though there was no more need to hide her warmth. She was not the goat woman any more, or, if she was, the word had changed its temperature entirely, and meant something a man would say with his hat off. The boy Toby stayed on and grew up half hers, and the herd grew to 110 head, and cleared the honeysuckle off the last of the neighbors' fence lines for hire, and the slope of Hardscrabble Knob, in a few more years, was the finest oak savanna in the district, deep-rooted and drought-proof and green when everything else was gray. The Thingmen drove out from the county seat to look at. Old Ilzabe Vandermolen lived to see it, and she came up the fence line one last autumn evening with a fresh jar of honey, and stood looking at the heeled slope in the low gold light, at the freestanding oaks and the shoulder-high grass, and the round stone mouth of the well she had walked past, unknowing for 40 years. She set the honey on the post the way she had the first day, and she said, in her soft rounded English, that she had told this child once that the land keeps an honest ledger but writes it very small and will not read it aloud, and that most people go their whole lives too proud to put their face down close and learn its hand. "But you learned it," she said. "You put your face down close in the dirt when they were all laughing on the hill, and you read what the land had written, and it was written there all the time, under the thief and the shade and the 40 years, waiting for someone quiet enough to listen." And Della Pruitt, who owned her 38 acres free and clear, and had never once regretted the $141.18 she paid for them, stood beside the old woman in the gold light, with the goats coming down off the slope behind her, and Deacon the old gray buck standing still as a peg in the middle of the moving herd. And she did not need to say anything at all, because the land had already read the verdict aloud, in the sweet plunk of a stone dropped down a well that everyone but the patient had forgotten, and it had found in her favor, the way it always does in the end, for the one who is willing to listen.
On va faire ça. Je pense que là, c'est bon. Comment tu vas, Jenny? Enfin, du coup. Tu dois être bien fatiguée, ma pauvre. Donc, je finis mon histoire. J'en étais au renversage de café un matin sur mon t-shirt. Ok. Je sais plus si ça en découle de cette fois-là ou de la fois d'après. Parce que, bien évidemment, Souki ne s'arrêtant pas là, j'ai recommencé une deuxième fois, un deuxième matin. J'avais un petit pull rose tout mignon. Tu vois, ça changeait du grand t-shirt un peu pyjama, tu vois, un petit pull mignon. Et bah non, tiens, t'allais quoi, même pas 4 jours après, hein, rebelote. Hein. Rebelote, le café sur le pull rose. Donc je ne sais plus si c'était lors du premier ou du deuxième renversage de